Okay, welcome back. We are here to wrap up chapter 3 of the Rathus text on sensation and perception. We finished up in the previous video discussing sound, the mechanisms of sound, the perceptions of sound, some theories about sound, etc., etc. So now we're going to move on and kind of do a crash course of the last few senses. So the next two we're going to look at are a little bit different from vision and sound, in the sense that we're no longer talking about electricity being involved. Now we're looking at chemical. The next two, smell and taste, are chemical senses. So a little bit differently as far as the mechanisms of how these things take place. But smell. It's interesting. Smell and taste often go hand in hand. So it makes sense to sort of talk about them together. The smell of foods, we smell something that will contribute to whether or not, we're going to like the food. If something, we can smell the flavor of something. You probably can walk inside your, the home of your parents or your caregiver, and if they're making something good, in the kitchen, you can smell it when you walk in. You can almost taste it in your mouth even. I mean, you can tell those sensations just go hand in hand. There's literally molecules floating around of the odor molecules, and they're sort of almost like enticing you. It reminds me of some of those old cartoons where you could literally see the molecules, and it's kind of drawing someone into the kitchen. Is what it reminds me of. And so, we have these receptors in our brain it's part of this olfactory system, is responsible for our sense of smell. We have an olfactory membrane, we have the olfactory nerve, and all of this information is relaying those chemical molecules, from that membrane to the nerve to the brain. And in some cases that leads to reactions like salivating, like, oh man, I'm really hungry now. I can smell my mom's cooking, and now I'm really hungry. Or sometimes we smell things that are very aversive, and they make us the opposite. Oh my gosh, somebody burnt food, and now I'm not hungry. Or somebody, hasn't taken out their trash. Now you know they need to take your trash out because I can really smell it when I walk into the house. We have reactions the other way as well, and those reactions, smell is very quick. And it's also interesting, we haven't talked about memory, but also think about the components of smell, the link from smell to memory. You smell a certain perfume, and now all of a sudden, or cologne, and all of a sudden you're thinking of a significant other from the past you haven't thought about in years. Maybe you don't live at home anymore with your parents, but when you walk into mom or dad's home or your caregiver's home and you smell certain foods or smells, maybe it just reminds you of things of your childhood. So not only is smell connected to taste, smell is also connected to our memory. So now let's switch gears and talk about taste. Again, we have taste cells, also known as taste buds. They're receptor cells along the tongue. We have cells specifically for different types of taste qualities, the flavors of sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. And actually a newer one, I say relatively new, within psychology, is this fifth one known as umami, is sort of a savory taste. You might get from foods that are high in protein. Like I think of eating a really good steak sometimes can have that really savory taste to it. The flavor of foods, it's really interesting. Flavor is not just, the taste buds, and it's not just the food itself, but there's a lot of things going on. The odor of the food, again, we talked about it in the previous slide. The odor, you walk in and smell a certain food, you walk into a restaurant and smell certain foods, and, you're hungry all of a sudden. Or if this food does not smell good, you can tell right away if food's not going to be good if it doesn't smell good. Sometimes that's how we check our food to make sure it's spoiled. You check your milk. Oh, hey, it's spoiled. I'm definitely not going to drink this. Or you accidentally drink spoiled. You put in your coffee and you accidentally drink it. Oh, my coffee's bad. Well, no wonder. The texture of things. For some reason, it's really hard for me to eat certain textured foods. I don't know if it was just growing up as a child. I just didn't like certain foods, vegetable textured foods growing up. So as an adult, I'm having to reteach myself how to eat certain foods because For the longest time, I had hangups about texture, but it really changes the flavor for some reason, psychologically. The temperature, I mean, some people love cold pizza. Some people will not eat pizza unless it's hot, but it's a different experience eating a fresh, hot slice of pizza versus eating a cold pizza. And obviously the taste of foods. I mean, you can add salt, you can add flavor, you can add this or add that. There's all kinds of factors. It's just really, I think what it's the point to illustrate is that there's so many factors that go into just something as simple as taste. We think it's just simple as our taste buds, but there's a lot more to it than meets the buds, so to speak. And of course there's sensitivity. Some people do have a different sensitivity. I mean, maybe that's why some people are foodies and others are not. If you have a high sensitivity to food, maybe you really enjoy lots of food, or maybe that works against you. You're really sensitive to food, so maybe you only like certain foods. I guess it could go different ways depending on how you look at it. So let's move on from taste. Let's talk about touch and pressure. We have different receptors all throughout our skin. Our skin is the biggest, I think if I'm remembering right, skin is like the skin in its entirety is like the biggest organ of the body. We have these different receptors all along our skin that will fire. The neurons will fire whenever we are touched or whenever we experience, whenever the surface of our skin is touched. I don't know a whole lot about this act of touching. That's kind of new. Kind of skipping over that. Sorry. You can read about that in your textbook if you'd like. Obviously, some areas of our body are more sensitive than others. And this makes sense. We talked about this a little bit in Chapter 2 when we looked at the brain. Specifically, we looked at the somatosensory cortex. Remember, the somatosensory cortex is that tiny strip of cortex in the parietal lobe, that's our where we experience touch, and along that strip of cortex, each part of our body is sort of mapped along that cortex, and if you stimulate that part of the cortex, you would also feel the sensation of touch along that specific part of the body. And so different parts of our body take up more room on the somatosensory cortex. For example, your hands and your face, things that are very sensitive to touch, because we use those things a lot, are going to take up a lot of space. You're going to have a lot more nerve endings in your hands and in your face versus maybe say like your elbow or like maybe your lower back or something. I guess you do have a lot of nerve endings there, but anyways, like your elbow doesn't have a whole lot of nerve endings, I guess, except for the one the funny bone you hit and then you feel all of it. But anyways, maybe that's not the best example, but anyways. Temperature, we also have receptors that are specifically fire. They respond to temperature. They respond to warmth as well as cold. We actually don't have our body. We don't have receptor cells that experience like something that is hot, like extremely hot. Like if we touch a hot stove, really what's actually happening is you're feeling the destruction of tissue. It's not specific receptor cells that are firing, hey, this is hot. No, your hand is literally just burning. So at a certain point, like warm water, your hand has receptor cells that if you were to put your hand under warm water and then under cool water, different cells are going to fire. But if you put your hand under scalding hot water, you're just literally burning your hand. It's not the same experience. The sensation of temperature is somewhat relative, or is relative. I mean, think about somebody who lives in Southern California or lives in Florida their entire life, and then they have no concept of winter. If they live in certain parts of those areas of the country, they may have no concept of winter and think hey, anything below 70 degrees is cold to me. But here in Oklahoma, where right now as I'm recording this video, I think it's like 30 or 40 degrees outside, and to me that's cold. But tomorrow it's supposed to be like 20 degrees and it's clearly colder. So right now I'm thinking, well, hey, today's pretty nice compared to what it's supposed to be like tomorrow. So, it is somewhat relative. Somebody who lives in Minnesota, my best friend lives in Minnesota, here I am complaining about 30-degree weather, and he's saying, hey, we've had single-digit temperatures since like December, and we've had 8 inches of snow, on certain days, and blah, blah, blah. So it certainly is a relative experience depending on where you live and kind of what you're used to. Sensation of pain, we have specific receptors in our body known as nociceptors, and they are stimulated when we experience pain. It's usually it's felt. It can be felt all throughout the body, very deeply in the body, depending on where where you where you're hurt. We don't have nerve endings in our for pain in the brain. That's one of the few places where you're not going to feel it, but everywhere else in your body you will. And your pain. Pain tends to originate at the point of contact. So, if you step on a Lego, you're walking at night and you step on one of your children's Legos, or you're walking to the kitchen and bump your funny bone or something like that, that's where you feel it at. And sometimes pain can radiate elsewhere. I don't know why it did that. I don't know why it switched that way. It changed the slide like that. But, emotional responses also affect degree of pain. I mean, if you have children or you have younger siblings, you might remember, think about a young child who's learning to walk for the first time, and that child walks and stumbles and they fall, and the child falls, and the child, what does a child typically do when they fall? Well, they look to their parent and they look up, or whoever's around. Maybe it's big brother, big sister, or mom or dad, and they look up and they're looking at, hey, what happened? What's the reaction? And if you, as the big brother, big sister, or mom or dad, or whoever, you say, oh my gosh, are you okay? And, are you hurt? And, you're immediately going to take care of the child. They may start crying and go, oh my gosh, you're right. I am hurt. Oh, I didn't know. It's crazy. I fell and I'm hurt. Whereas, sometimes parents, if you react, or the brother and sister react and say, hey, you okay? Time to get up. Let's try again. Children, there is this sort of psychological, emotional component to pain. Think about like athletes who get really hyped up, and after, I think about like Isaiah Thomas, the famous basketball player who, he hurt his ankle, like badly sprained his ankle in a game in the finals, the NBA finals. This is like in like 1990, so this is probably really dated. But he came out and played because the moment, the intensity, the emotions of the moment. I mean, I think Paul Pierce did that a few years ago. That's a more recent example in basketball that helps. So emotions are involved in pain too. It's not. There we go. There's the slide. Sorry, it's really weird. We also have some other chemicals at work as far as pain is concerned. The nociceptors are respond to pain. Prostaglandins are what sort of transmit that information to the brain. And there's a lot going on during pain. Obviously, our body responds to pain, obviously by relaying messages to the brain, but the body also mobilizes resources to deal with pain. It starts circulating white blood cells, red blood cells, all this stuff throughout the body that's needed to, produce inflammation and to protect the injured area. Sometimes it'll even produce pain-relieving drugs. Like endorphins, like we talked about, I think in chapter 2. This is when the body goes into kind of like an emergency response mode. Hey, we're in pain. Let's take care of this. So it's really fascinating how well the body can take care of itself. At least initially in dealing with pain. Obviously, when there's massive amounts of pain or a really bad injury, I mean, obviously your body can only do so much, and that's when you have to rely on modern medicine. Okay, a really fascinating phenomenon related to pain is called phantom limb syndrome, or phantom limb pain, and this is where somebody who has lost a limb, for example, sometimes this is very commonly reported for people who have lost limbs in combat, where they will report feeling sensation in where a missing limb once was, like they lost an arm or a hand, and they still feel some kind of nerve or sensation where that hand used to be. And if you have the time, I highly recommend Google V.S. Ramachandran. He is a researcher who studies phantom limb syndrome, and he did some fascinating research with helping patients who have phantom limb pain overcome their pain by tricking the brain. He used this device called a mirror box, where a patient would put their fully functioning hand, the hand that's still attached, into this box. And in the box is a mirror. And so if they look at that mirror, it looks like they have two hands again. It tricks the brain into thinking, oh, I see two hands again. And, they can sort of learn to move this phantom hand, like grip and ungrip, and it helps relieve some of the pressure. Again, please go watch it for yourself. It is absolutely fascinating. So I kind of already gave the answer away. Truth or fiction, many people experience pain in limbs that have been amputated. What do you think? Pause the video. Come back. Check your comprehension. Welcome back. It is true. Just talked about it in the last slide. Again, Google V.S. Ramachandran. This guy does some fascinating work. He has TED Talks about this stuff, full documentaries as well. So check it out. Some more about pain. We have a threshold for how much pain we can actually tolerate at one time. According to gate theory, we can sort of overwhelm our sense of pain. We can overwhelm that sensation of pain. Let's say, you hit your funny bone, and as you're walking to the kitchen, to get a snack, you can immediately start rubbing that area to sort of overwhelm. You can I'm even doing it now as I speak. You may be able to hear it. The mic be able to pick it up. But if you start rubbing the area, rubbing your elbow, maybe you can kind of overwhelm it, and it prevents the brain from kind of relaying those transmission of pain signals to the brain. So I think there's some limitations to this. I think if you were to sustain a really bad injury, fall and break your leg, it's not like you could just hey, let me rub my broken leg and everything will be fine. Please don't do that. That's not what I'm saying. But for normal bumps and bruises, maybe you can kind of trick yourself. Hey, you step on a Lego in the middle of the night, instead of screaming at your child for leaving their Legos out, maybe take a minute, rub your foot, call it a night, go back to bed. So anyways, that's gate theory. Acupuncture, this is another sort of a technique for controlling pain. Some people who have chronic pain will use acupuncture. I've never personally used acupuncture, but I have done dry needling before when I was dealing with a herniated disc in my back. I went to a physical therapist to use dry needling, which is very similar to acupuncture. The idea behind it is that it will stimulate the release of endorphins and cortisol in the body, and it helps overwhelm that sensation of pain and make you feel pretty good. And never tried acupuncture, can't speak to it, but there's a lot of people who speak to the efficacy of that. So something to look into if you have pain. But talk to your doctor first. Don't just go find an acupuncture. Please talk to a doctor. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and talk about Kenneths Thesis, our sense of movement. Broadly speaking, it's our sense of movement, but also, these are two other senses that we're going to add to the discussion of sensation. So Kenneths Thesis is our sense of our body, where our limbs are, the position of our body, the motion of our body. Basically, this is what tells us that our body is in motion. It is relayed from our joints, our tendons, and muscles, and it relays to the body. This is what, if you ever performed in athletics, gymnastics, things like that, if you use your body a lot, you rely heavily on this sense. Not having this sense to me would be like having vertigo. I'm assuming you would just be sort of out of balance. You wouldn't be able to move your body properly. And sort of conversely, there's also the vestibular sense, and this comes from these semicircular canals in our ears, which you should remember from earlier in this chapter. And these literally tell our body whether we are upright or not. That's why, when you wake up from sleep, your body, immediately, oh, I'm laying down. I'm not standing up. I'm not a horse. I'm not standing up. Horses sleep standing up or whatever. But it informs your body, hey, I'm upright or I'm not. Very useful sense, again, if you move your body a lot, if you're a dancer, if you're a gymnast, you're an athlete, you rely on both of these tremendously. We all do, but some of us, if your job or your passions or your hobbies involve using your body in a way of movement, then you do, of course, rely heavily on this stuff. Okay, so last thing we're going to talk about is ESP. Extrasensory perception. So sort of throwing this at the end in a chapter of sensation and perception makes a little sense. Different studies, there's parapsychological psi-phenomenon, precognition, psychokinesis, telepathy, clairvoyance, seeing in the future, all this stuff. But here's the deal. There's really no research that supports any of this whatsoever. Hate to burst your bubble. It's really interesting. Makes for great conversation. Makes for cool movies, TV shows, pop culture, stuff like that. But there's literally no research that backs up ESP at all. In fact, I believe there was a researcher. I think it might be on this slide. Never mind. These not the right slide. I can't remember this person's name, but there was an organization who offered $1 million for anybody who would come into their laboratory and prove the existence of things like ESP. Extrasensory perception. And as you can imagine, They have cut zero checks. They have cut zero checks. There are people who probably tried some of these examples. Here, Joseph Banks Rhine, Gansfeld. I mean, there's some stuff that's at least addressed these ideas, but there's no research that suggests, hey, there's even a possibility of ESP. It's just not there. Sorry to burst your bubble. But if you believe in ESP, you can, raise my hand. Oh, you can't see my hand, but it was raised, I promise. Okay, so, yeah, that's it for Chapter 3. That's it for ESP. We have covered the gamut of the 5 senses that you are aware of, plus a couple more. But again, that was not the end-all, be-all. There's sense of direction, sense of time, plenty of other senses we could probably think of or come up with and talk about. But for the sake of this course, we're going to stop here. We will come back. Our next chapter is going to be on consciousness, a shorter chapter, but I think a very fascinating chapter. I hope you enjoy. So thanks for tuning in to Chapter 3, and I'll see you all next time.